Morning. I'm reminded, having been here now on the third year, I think, for Nanotech, meeting FiRe and Mark kindly inviting us, of a repartee between Winston Churchill and George Bernard Shaw. At the bottom of his popularity, Winston Churchill's popularity, George Bernard Shaw sent him a telegram, said, "I've got a new play opening up enclosed. Please find 2 tickets. Please come and bring a friend if you have one." And about a day later, Winston Churchill wrote back and said, "Impossible to attend the first night. We'll attend the second night if you have one." So very glad to be back here. What I'm going to do is very quickly introduce my esteemed panelists here. We've got a guy that's been on Wall Street for some time and became a venture guy and then went into the world of drug development. And this is just a small, slow-talking Iowa farm boy. And this is Al Beardsley, who's the CEO of Kereos. And then to my immediate left is Larry Bock, who has founded or been the initial CEO of some 33 companies, 17 of which he proactively created from scratch, having read a paper in Science or Nature. And 14 of those are publicly traded today, cumulative market cap in excess of about $20 billion. And on top of this, it's notable that he is actually legally blind, and he does drive, too, so you should all be very afraid. And he drives a Prius. Let me have you each just quickly introduce the company that you are CEO of, and in full disclosure, our firm is an investor in both of them. Explain the company that you're chairing or CEO of, and who backed you, how much you raised, and 1 year hence, if you were to return here, what you'd like to have accomplished.
Well, at Kereos, we're working on targeted imaging agents and targeted therapeutics for cancer. So for the buzzword folks in the audience, personalized medicine. In the past year, we closed on a $20 million Series B. That'll get us into the clinic. So next year, I'll be back, hopefully, talking about being in the clinic with our 2 lead agents. One is a MRI agent that can find tumors as small as 1 or 2 millimeters in size, huge advance. The other is a targeted chemotherapeutic that gives you the kick of Taxol without the toxic side effects. It was a great bunch of investors. It kind of bridges, and it probably represents kind of the whole nano biotech kind of world. Traditional life science investors like Charter out of Palo Alto, Genentech, Philips Medical, and then nanotech investors such as yourself and Harris & Harris Group.
Okay. And Larry, Nanosys?
So Nanosys is about a 4-year-old company based in Palo Alto. We're focused on inorganic nanostructures. These are nanostructures made out of materials like silicon, gallium arsenide, indium phosphide. And we're applying these to applications like solar cells, flexible displays, medical devices. We have raised about $100 million to date from leading venture investors like Venrock, Polaris, and Arch, as well as leading strategic investors like Intel, SAIC, Kodak, and Medtronic.
Okay. Let's start it off right now. Tell me, what is nanotech, just for the layman's audience?
Maybe actually better to say what it's not before saying what it is. So nanotech is not microtechnology. Microtechnology is a miniaturization and integration play, a miniaturization of components and then integrating them one after another to create complex devices. Nanotechnology is not microtechnology. Nanotechnology is not about being smaller. It's about being different as a result of being smaller. Turns out when you get down to this size scale, you get completely new properties that have not been harnessed by any technology to date. And we take advantage of those properties.
And I think we'll go into some of those properties and explain what the heck we've got here on the table in a moment. But tell me, what's your interest in the intersection between nanotech and biotech?
Well, first, I'm probably the skeptic up here on nanotechnology, especially nanobiotechnology. But just as Larry said, it's the ability to do things that you couldn't do on any other scale. And where you apply good, solid drug development principles to that and can then integrate these functions that you can only do on a small scale, a nanotech scale, we're able to couple diagnosis and therapy and monitoring therapy together in one product as opposed to having to try and design some Frankenstein molecule that would do all 3.
Okay. And Larry, tie in, 20 years as a veteran venture guy, founding all these companies in biotech. It's a pretty saturated space today, a lot of venture guys chasing after it. What was the shift? What are the parallels between nanotech that you saw over 2 decades of biotech?
Yeah, I actually think that nanotechnology has a huge number of parallels to biotechnology. Maybe 4 major ones. Like biotechnology, it's largely a platform technology. It's one common core technology that you can apply to multiple different industries. Also, like biotech, it's very intellectual property intensive. So you can control the entire intellectual property food chain in nanotech, from composition of matter patents to the simplest functional building block to the end application and all the processes in order to do that. Like biotech also, it's going to be an industry that is where major corporations outsource their R&D to smaller companies. So my company, as an example, has gotten major funding from companies like Sharp, Intel, DuPont, SAIC, and so forth to build this technology. And like biotech, it has one other thing in common, and that is a high dependence on very, very smart people. So in biotech, in pharmaceutical discovery, prior to the advent of recombinant DNA technology, your success was directly related to your scale of operations. And then all of a sudden, along comes this new technology, and now your success is not related to your scale of operations, but how clever your scientists that you can bring together. The same exact thing is happening in nanotechnology.
Okay. Now, when we think about this, it's, as you said, not just the miniaturization and scaling down of things, but there are 3 or 4 pretty big ideas in nanotech. And some of these, I think, are encapsulated on some of the show and tell stuff that we've brought on the table. The first idea is this idea of the bottom-up manufacturing. Right? So some people think of this as the holy grail, but whether it's semiconductor processing or whether it's in biotechnology, the ability to create new drugs that are essentially developed, de novo from the bottom up. What is it about bottoms-up manufacturing that enables some of these advances in nanotech?
So in contrast, once again, to microtechnology, in microtechnology, as you make features smaller and smaller, your cost of doing that goes up dramatically, both your capital, your need for capital equipment as well as your variable costs. In nanotechnology, it's no more expensive to make a nanostructure that is 1 nanometer in diameter versus one that's 100 nanometer in diameter, because you're utilizing low-cost, simple chemical reactors to build these structures from the bottom up, basically atom by atom. This little structure here is a really good example of this. This is not a nanostructure. This is a nanostructure. This is a model of it. Each one of these little dots here is an individual atom, so the entire structure is on the order of 100 atoms. This structure is about 100 times smaller than the smallest structure that Intel can make in the most sophisticated microfabrication environment, billion-dollar fab. But it has features that are 100 times smaller, and it is made in an extremely low-cost chemical reactor, maybe a $100,000 type of chemical reactor. Just to give you a frame of reference of this structure, if this structure were, if a nanostructure were this size, this would be the size of the Earth. So, it's a tremendously small structure.
Now, in the past, I've demonstrated, I think it was last year, the quantum dots and this kind of principle between the separation of functional and processing properties of a material, right? That the way you make it and the way that and what it actually does can be separated, or maybe not. Describe again these quantum dots.
So it turns out when you get down to structures along this size, which is less than about 10 nanometers, everything completely changes. So all of a sudden now you can define the physical, optical, magnetic, thermal properties of a structure to exactly what you want it and fine-tune that. So for example, this set of vials here all have the exact same thing in them. The only difference is in this first vial, all the particles are about 2 nanometers in diameter, or about 8 atoms thick. This one, they're 3 nanometers, 4 nanometers, 5 nanometers, respectively. If we dim the back lights a little bit, you'll see if we optically then or electrically stimulate them, they're all completely different. So for the very first time in material science, you can independently control a material's functional properties, its optical, magnetic, thermal, electronic properties, from its processing properties. All the things in those vials are made the same way. You put them into a manufacturing environment, they process identically, but they have all completely different functional properties. That's in sharp contrast to something that you may be more familiar with, like OLEDs, organic LEDs in your cell phone. With OLEDs, every color is a different chemical. Every chemical is made by a different process. You can't make most of the colors in this world, and you put them into your manufacturing environment, they're all completely different. In this world, they're all made the same way, they all process the same way, and you can define them to exactly what you want.
So I've coined this kind of, I always preemptively apologize because it's a little bit of a cheesy word, but this idea of complexity, that you can take complexity out of a traditionally mechanical engineering process and put it into the complexity of a molecule, essentially getting rid of devices. How do you do that on the biotech side? How do you introduce functionality into the molecules?
Well, I think the key components of any nanobiotech, at least as we practice it, is you have to be able to target specifically. I mean, that's where medicine is going, is the ability to target disease, to target patients specifically. Then you have to choose what you want to do with that targeting, and then you have to have something that's going to pass muster with the FDA and with the clinical world in terms of safety, in terms of more and more cost of goods manufactured. But what you can do when you work on the nanotech level is combine those things without having to build something like that. It combines both targeting and therapeutic function and diagnostic function. So you could do it, in our case, what we use is a perfluorocarbon emulsion droplet. So in fact, we can use the same manufacturing process for each individual product. We just change the ingredient that goes in terms of targeting a specific cancer or targeting cardiovascular disease, or we change the payload, whether it's an imaging agent for MRI or for nuclear imaging, or it's a therapeutic like paclitaxel or even gene therapy.
Okay. Now, what about you in terms of the integrated functionality in a molecule? We talked about the solar cell, right? So the idea that you can take a big hunk of blue solar cell that we're putting on our roofs and getting subsidies and economically might not make sense, and shrinking that down essentially where the entire device is the molecule. What about in, say, the area of displays?
So a good example of something that we do, and maybe I'll take this apart to sort of show that, we can make another nanostructure that looks more like this. It's a nanowire. In fact, this nanowire has a bunch of components to it. It has a shell, a semiconducting shell, a dielectric shell outside of that, and then a conducting gate shell outside of that. Those nanowires are grown on a simple wafer. So this wafer here has enough tiny nanowire transistors to cover 2 Gen 7 display panels. Those nanowires are harvested off of this wafer into an ink. So they're literally floating around in this ink. So there are several trillion tiny nanowire transistors in this vial here. And then those transistors are then inkjet printed onto a piece of plastic. So now on this piece of plastic here, and if you look it up closely, you can see the electronics on this have all the performance properties now of electronics done on a single crystal silicon wafer, but now they can be done on a completely flexible substrate. So if you look at a display today, this is what a display looks like if you ever took your computer apart. You've got a piece of glass with a lot of sophisticated electronics behind it, and then you've got all these edge electronics that drive each of the lines and columns. A lot of sophisticated electronics here. That all gets replaced with a simple thing that looks like this, based on utilizing nanotechnology.
So let's talk economics now. What kind of process are you using to make that? What does it cost today? Who loses because of that? Who are the people that get cut out of a supply chain?
So if you look at this display today, you've got a company like Corning that makes this expensive piece of glass. Then you have companies like TSMC and so forth that make all these edge electronics. And then you have a display manufacturer that integrates it all together. Well, Corning kind of disappears because now you don't need the expensive glass anymore. You can do it on a completely flexible substrate. All this edge electronics disappears because this is so now high performance that it can be integrated completely on this piece of plastic. And the value now gets shifted from between the display manufacturer and the manufacturer of the nanotechnology.
And one of the other interesting things, and kind of the last big idea in our framework in nanotech, is the idea of using biology, right, for inspiration. Billions of years of evolution to be able to reverse engineer things that don't naturally occur in nature that we can make synthetically. How are you both doing things in that space?
I think one of the things when we talk about nanotechnology is that it's a big umbrella. And so, for example, what we're doing is much more akin to monoclonal antibodies than it would be to quantum dots. And so, for example, we think of what we're doing as synthetic biologics. You're taking specific targeting for disease and coupling it with some kind of effector, whether it be a diagnostic or it be a therapeutic.
And while we're getting fixed here, Larry, talk maybe about some of the biological inspiration, some of the uses for nanotech.
Got another good example of that. Show you if the camera can zoom in on this. This piece of plastic here is coated with tiny nanostructures that are little hairs. They're about maybe a 1/150,000th the width of a human hair, tiny nanostructures on this surface. And you can see that when the surface is treated with these nanostructures, they literally won't interact with the fluid at all. So if I take a fluid on this, and I don't know if you can see this, it literally bounces off the surface and so forth. Clever little thing. Everybody thinks about windshield wipers, windshieldless windshield wipers. But imagine coating a heart valve or a stent with this, so nothing will bind to the surface of that. That's some examples of applications that we're utilizing in the medical device area, utilizing nanotechnology.
Let's turn to somebody that you're going to hear from next. Bill Janeway has very thoughtful arguments about why materials in particular have never been great markets, right? That it could take $1 billion and maybe 10 years to get a new material to market, which is basically the equivalent of the risk you're taking in an FDA process. Right. And you don't have, the interim exits that you do necessarily in a market that's willing to take risks as you go through phase 1, phase 2. How would you counter that logic? What's missing there?
I think what's missing there is the thinking about nanotechnology as a materials play. Nanotechnology, there are materials applications in nanotechnology, but nanotechnology, in both of our examples, literally allows you for the first time to integrate into that material device functionality. So as I showed you here, in this vial, this is in one sense a material, but these are really trillions of tiny little nanowire transistors. They're high-performance transistors. In fact, they're transistors that have higher performance than the best transistor that Intel can make it with a top-down process, but they're made with very simple bottom-up type processes. They're packaged in a different format, in this case in an ink, so that you can spray coat them onto something, but they have a huge amount of value because they have a device integrated into the tiny little nanostructure.
Would I be right in saying there that material is the device?
The material is the device, and then it needs to be processed in a way to create it into a format for a display or a memory or a phased array antenna, or whatever the end application you want.
Now, obviously, in nanobiotech, you don't have that problem because the FDA has already imposed that 10-year time frame on you. So it kind of, I guess, it kind of makes the entire point moot. But I think that it's the same idea. You're really trying to integrate a device on almost a molecular level, kind of a supramolecular level.
In your dealings with people like the National Cancer Institute, the NIH, some of the three-letter agencies, how are they looking at this? Are they looking at it with a skeptical eye? Are they starting to put money in it?
I think NCI, a lot of people at NCI, National Cancer Institute, have staked their careers on nanotechnology being an answer to a big part of the challenge of cancer. They just put $150 million, pulled it out of other programs, and dedicated it to the Cancer Nanotechnology Initiative. And I think you heard it here first. I think you're going to see, for instance, National Heart, Lung, and Blood, the cardiovascular equivalent at NIH, doing a similar kind of emphasis, moving into nanotech for cardiovascular disease as well.
Well, most people think about cancer today, right? We know that the goal here is maybe not a cure, but to make it a livable condition, something akin to diabetes. The way that we treat it today is really the equivalent of basically poisoning somebody via chemotherapy or burning them with radiation. What are you doing that's changing that?
What we're doing is we're trying to focus down first trying to diagnose the patient more carefully so that you know what is going to work on them, so that you know that they definitely have cancer, so that you find the cancer earlier, which is really the key to making it a livable condition or perhaps even curing it. And then second, we're targeting therapy to the cancer specifically so that it avoids all the side effects, the alopecia and the nerve damage and the cardiac toxicities that a lot of the classical cytotoxics have. And then finally, we're monitoring therapeutic response to make sure that we're not treating people, even with a relatively benign therapy, who just aren't responding to that. So you can move on to the next thing and find something that works.
Let's talk about some of the issues that you've raised with me about environmental stuff and concerns and some of the cynicism, almost kind of the cynical view of nanotech. What are some of the issues out there, aside from all the hyperbole and the excitement and why things are different? What are the thoughtful things that you have to be thinking about?
Well, from developing a pharmaceutical product, especially in the US and Europe and Japan and a lot of the other countries, there is a very tough regulatory environment that I think a lot of folks who are doing the cutting edge work in nanotechnology, in nanobiotechnology, don't take into account. These are complex products, manufacturing, cost of goods, bioanalytical, analytical, excretion, even something as simple as metabolism and excretion, folks don't think of it. They get a great response from a few mice and they publish in New England Journal of Medicine, and they forget that it may never be a drug. And that's due partly to the fact that a lot of this work is being done at a lot of the expertise is in academic centers where they don't have experience taking things forward and fully fleshing them out as a drug. So I'm highly skeptical of most things I read about the latest nanoparticle in the trade journals and in things like New England Journal of Medicine, because in most cases, once you lift the hood, if you have any drug development experience, you discover these things are never going to fly. On the flip side, a lot of the pharma companies are now saying, I've got to be in nanotechnology, and I think that they're right, but they oftentimes seem to be jumping at whatever the business development people have sold them, and 2 years after they get it in-house, their scientists tell them, guess what, it's never going to fly. They aren't as experienced in nanotech, and so they're buying things that may not make it.
We own a market research firm that of all the industries, all the different sectors, they say that pharma is the one that has not caught on to nanotech. That for some reason there's a version internally, whatever it is. What are you seeing there? Why are these guys not clued in?
Well, I think it's primarily a fear of the FDA, which I think is somewhat misplaced, actually. The FDA has actually been, with respect to ourselves, very, I wouldn't say accommodating. We have to meet all the rules, but they've been very supportive in terms of being willing to meet frequently and in a collaborative fashion. But I think for the pharmaceutical industry, these are things that, it's entirely an unknown world. They know what small molecules are going to do. In the case of Genentech, they know what monoclonal antibodies are going to do. But now you're assembling structures on the nanometer scale that have all kinds of different functionalities, and they're frankly scared of what the FDA is going to do in terms of developing those.
I'm reminded of an anecdote I think Warren Buffett had told about an old man in the living room, and his wife says, I want you to take me upstairs and make love to me. And he says, I'll do one or the other, but not both. And in some cases, there's this idea of this dichotomy where companies are saying, on the one hand, everything that we're doing is totally revolutionary here in nanotech. But then they get into this environmental argument where they say, no, we've got all the safety issues in place, and this is just like we've always been doing. And they can't really have their cake and eat it too. What are you seeing? You've been appointed to a task force for the government here for environmental. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest fears in the nanotechnology industry is how it's going to be regulated. And I think one of the key things that we have to keep in mind is that nanotechnology is not one thing, it's 1,000 different things. And each one of these different applications has to be looked at, from a different perspective. So for example, if you take carbon nanotubes and you make metric tons of them and you fill rubber tires with them to reinforce that, well, that's has a completely different set of risk benefits than if you take a single carbon nanotube and you make a high performance sensor out of it. And you have to look at those different applications depending on their risk benefit and value.
Josh, to amplify what Larry said, is anybody here from the FDA? Before I say this, okay, good. If you look at the documents we file with the FDA, you will never see a single mention of nanotechnology or nanoparticle in them, because that elicits all the worst. It elicits the lowest common denominator factor. They think of everything that they've seen about toxicity of fullerenes or of nanowires and whatnot, and they start to apply that to you. So with the FDA, we're all about targeted perfluorocarbon emulsions. Perfluorocarbon emulsions have been through the regulatory process. Emulsions have been a pharmaceutical matter of trade for 40 years. And so you have to be really careful with this umbrella of nanobiotechnology, because the first time somebody has an oops, they're going to apply it to us, much as they applied, every outcome in gene therapy to every gene therapy company. So we're very careful, at least in the regulatory milieu, to not be nanotechnology.
I've shared this anecdote in the past, I'm sure, but some of the policymakers in California were up in arms about a chemical, dihydrogen monoxide, DHMO, that they were very concerned caused billions of dollars of property damage, was found in cancer tumors, was found in cult rituals. If you inhale it, you die. And they had voted to ban this molecule. And how many people have heard of DHMO before? Just a handful. So this county actually, got rid of it, and then they had a lot of egg on their face when they found out that dihydrogen monoxide, dihydrogen, H2, monoxide, O, it was water. So if you present anything in an alarmist, fear-mongering way, it will elicit that same kind of psychological response. What other things keep you guys up at night right now? What things are you worried about?
Well, you know, it's not nanotech related. I mean, we're in the drug development world, and we're heading towards the clinic with 2 lead candidates. It's all the classical drug development. I think that's maybe a lesson as people look at nanotechnology, is you've got to worry about the industry of the application, and that's what's got to keep you up at night. You can't think of yourself, well, with the exception of the king of nanotechnology, who basically is enabling a bunch of different industries. You can't think of yourself as being nanotechnology. You have to focus on your industry of application.
And what would you be most excited about? What's got you passionate right now?
Well, you know, every time we cure cancer in a mouse, that gets me excited. I'm just waiting to do it in humans.
Larry?
I think coming up with nanotech solutions to renewable energy, such as solar cells or fuel cells.
And what keeps you worried?
Worried? I mean, there's a lot of technological challenges in this. Every single thing that we do in our company has never, ever been done before. So there's good news and bad news there. It's never been done before. The good news is it's a piece of intellectual property that keeps someone else from doing it.
I think we've got about 3 minutes left or so. Let's open it up quickly to questions for anybody that wants to jump to the mic and spur some controversy or ask any questions.
Hi, it's Larry Smar. So I really love your plastic with the nanowires. One of the things I've been saying is that we're going to end up with essentially, you know, gigapixel wallpaper that you buy at Home Depot on rolls. This is the closest thing to some of the, you know, research that's headed in that direction, and that it would be a completely different technology from the way we, you know, have all these LCDs around here. Could you talk just a little bit more about the ability to use this for, you know, high resolution, vast pixel real estate imaging surfaces?
Yeah, so I mean, what this technology is competing, this is a technology not competing with microelectronics, this is competing with something called macroelectronics. Being able to deposit of electronics over very large areas like a, you know, your flat panel display that you have at home. What's nice about this technology is that because you basically put these tiny nanostructures into an ink and then you use a low-cost processing method, either inkjet printing or a roll-to-roll doctor blading type system to organize these nanostructures over a piece of plastic or glass, it's no more expensive to do that to make a 2-inch display than it is to make, you know, a 100-inch display because the electronics, you know, are just simply deposited. So I mean, this definitely addresses any kind of application where you want to put electronics over very, very large areas, whether it be a display like you mentioned or something like a phased array beam steerable antenna. So I don't know if you know these antennas that they have in the Navy on the Aegis destroyer. Currently, those antennas cost about $1 million per square meter to make because they have a huge amount of sophisticated electronics. They got this highly complex heterogeneous integration problem. Well, this type of technology allows you to take something like that and do it for $100 a square meter. So now you can take the communications capability of the Aegis destroyer and put it on a soldier's backpack. So.
And InQtel, the venture arm of the CIA, is an investor in Nanosys and one of our other portfolio companies. So if you find Larry afterwards, and as long as you don't kill them, they can find out some information. Question?
Yeah, follow-up question. Scott Foster from HSBC in Tokyo. There's a number of companies in Japan and elsewhere that have made investments in inkjet technology recently, I think for precisely the reasons you've explained. But the progress is not all that rapid. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the manufacturing constraints, things like are the nano inks resistant to thermal inkjet printing techniques, things like that. Also, somebody mentioned that materials are not a good investment. And perhaps that's one reason why the Japanese dominate advanced industrial materials. Obviously on the EC side, the American financial system is the most effective. Is there something dysfunctional when it comes to turning these things into physical products?
So I'll take the latter part, which I think we answered a little bit earlier in the idea that investing in pure bulk raw materials is indeed not necessarily a good investment. But if you're able to find the science and technology where the entire device that you're trying to replace is the material, then you've got something that's akin to the shift from big pharma to Genentech in biotech, and what we're seeing today from TI and Intel and others to folks like Nanosys and others. I don't know if you revealed who your partner is on the display side.
Yeah, our partner is Sharp Electronics, but maybe your question's a technical one. So what's actually in this solution is there's a polymer, to basically as the ink, but inside that ink are tiny little nanowires. Those nanowires are made out of silicon, so they are basically the same materials that are on a silicon wafer. Silicon, as you know, are inorganic materials. They're very resistant to high temperature type processing. So there's a lot of high temperature steps that go into making this, but they're done all offline prior to putting it on the piece of plastic, which is all a low temperature process after that.
I think we're about done. Larry Bock and Al Beardsley, please give them a hand.